Thank you for coming to learn about the democracy crisis. This talk is part of the Ultimate Civics project. Ultimate Civics is the 21st century civil rights movement, human rights versus corporate rights. My name is Ricky Ott, and I have first-hand experience with the democracy crisis as the survivor of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. What are the first three words of the U.S. Constitution? Do you know? We the people. We're going to take a look at what this meant some 200 years ago when our Constitution was ratified and what it means now. Our examination will lead to a discovery that our democracy is not what we think it is. Then we're going to talk about what we can do to create the democracy we thought we had. This is what we think we have. Three branches of government: the legislature makes law, the judiciary interprets law, and the executive branch enforces the law. There's a system of checks and balances to keep it all working. We the people are the ultimate check and balance in our sovereign self-governance. This is what we teach our children. To understand the roots of the democracy crisis, we need to go back to the period around the American Revolution, because our government is a product of the American War. This was a time when people were rebelling against power, the power of monarchy and money. The Declaration of Independence was adopted in 1776. Our first Constitution was ratified in 1781 during the war. This was a bold document with no centralized power. After the war, the first Constitution was replaced with the second one, the one we have today. Our Constitution centralizes power and protects property and commerce, but it left out human rights. People objected, resulting in a hastily crafted and adopted Bill of Rights, which gave some people, but not all people, rights. We have to look at who drafted the constitutions. The drafters did not include the rich diversity of early Americans. Left out were the common people. Instead, the drafters were, as one historian called it, the well-bred, well-fed, well-read, and well-wed, white males with property, who represented about 10% of the population. Let's call this the ruling minority. In terms of allocating power, the ruling minority, masquerading as we the people, made themselves sovereign and private and gave themselves rights. But the American Revolution taught that government and corporations were not to be trusted. So, government and corporations were made public, they were held accountable, and they were tasked with duties. Corporations were also given limited privileges. So what exactly is a corporation? The American Heritage Dictionary defines corporation as a body of persons acting under a legal charter as a separate entity having its own rights, privileges, and liabilities. This way of doing business is not new. It came over from England. So what exactly is a corporation? A corporation is a legal fiction. It's something the law created so a group of people could own property, have contracts, sue or be sued. In other words, do business. Courts treat corporations as artificial persons. But remember the Boston Tea Party? People did not trust corporations. So, 200 years ago, people retained tight control over corporations through state legislatures. People made sure corporations existed for public benefit, only for a limited time, and they could not own stock in other corporations, among other restrictions. Fast forward to today. Our U.S. Constitution is an anomaly. It stands out for not including fundamental human rights and for not including provisions for contracts. By not separating people and contracts, we set up a process for giving the same rights to people and property. Blurring of rights occurred in three phases. During roughly the first 100 years, state legislatures started doling out privileges to corporations, things like limited liability for shareholders, perpetual existence, virtual location, and others. During the second phase, state and federal courts began handing out constitutional rights to corporations. We're going to focus more on this later. Now, in the third phase, corporations can make their own global rights through trade agreements. The Commerce Clause of the Constitution seems like an innocuous place for courts to start doling out corporate rights. But in 1819, the Supreme Court ruled that private contracts included corporate charters. In other words, States now could not interfere with private contracts. The rest is history. Courts began to boldly and steadily elevate the legal status of corporations above people and states. But let's remember that corporations are really the wealthy ruling minority. This Supreme Court decision led Thomas Jefferson to warn, "Our country is now taking so steady a course as to show by what road it will pass to destruction, to wit, by consolidation of power first, and then by corruption, its necessary consequence. The engine of consolidation will be the federal judiciary, the other two branches the corrupting and corrupted instruments." Time passed. People's movements for basic human rights grew stronger. The ruling minority looked to the courts for ways to consolidate its power over the people. Thomas Jefferson was right. Remember that the word corporation does not appear in our Constitution or Bill of Rights. Yet in 1893, the Supreme Court found corporations in the Fifth Amendment, which is about protecting persons from being deprived of property without due process of law. The Supreme Court ruled that corporations were also entitled to due process. This gives corporations the right to challenge government actions that protect the environment. More on the Fifth Amendment later. The 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War. It was designed to give African American men due process and equal protection. The ruling minority saw this as an opportunity to further consolidate its power. 307 lawsuits were brought under the 14th Amendment during the first 20 years after it passed. Of these, 19 were brought by African American men. The other 288 were brought by corporations. In 1886, the Supreme Court gave equal protection to corporations. In other words, the Supreme Court made corporate persons equal to human persons under the law. This ruling created the corporate Frankenstein, corporate persons endowed with human rights. This ruling reallocated power. It moved corporate persons from the government side to the people side. Corporate persons still had privileges, but now they were also private, sovereign, and endowed with human rights. This made the ruling minority very happy. Why? Because now they could disappear and let the so-called free market guide the country while they consolidated enormous wealth, power, and privilege over the people. Years later, this led people like Charlie Wilson, the head of General Motors, to imply things like, "What's good for General Motors is good for America." Corporate capitalism was on a roll. The road to the demise of our democracy is paved with court rulings. In 1906, under the Fourth Amendment, the Supreme Court ruled that corporate persons had protection against unreasonable searches. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that corporate persons had a right to demand a search warrant for monitoring regulatory compliance. How many corporate polluters do you think our government will catch if our government has to warn the corporations they are coming for inspections? Corporations continue to bring cases under the Fifth Amendment for protection of property. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled there would be no taking of property without compensation. Corporate persons now can assert that our government can use taxpayers' money to compensate corporations for takings. For example, after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, the tanker Exxon Valdez was banned by law from operating in Alaska. Exxon sued under the Fifth Amendment to bring the banned tanker back into service in Alaska, claiming that the ban was an illegal taking of profits. How did this work? The Alaska oil trade was more profitable for Exxon than the foreign trade, so Exxon was losing money on this tanker. Its profits were being taken because of a federal law. In this case, the ban was upheld, but it took time, money, and effort to fight Exxon. Corporations have also usurped our Sixth and Seventh Amendment rights. In 1908, the Supreme Court ruled that corporate persons have the right to a jury trial in criminal cases. Then, in 1970, the Supreme Court ruled corporate persons also have a right to a jury trial in civil cases. This leads to the ridiculous situations where ordinary people are pitted against multi-billion-dollar corporations. When this happens, we mostly lose. Let me tell you, as a survivor of the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the 20-year lawsuit against Exxon, there is no equal treatment under the law. For example, Exxon had to stall through the appeals because it was profitable to do so. Interest on jury awards accrues at 6%, while the stock market back in the 1990s was earning 18%. Exxon's shareholders could have sued if Exxon had paid the jury award. It's not just Exxon that plays the stall game. In the end, in our case, we recovered about 10% of our economic losses related to the oil spill. But we lost far more than money. Our compensation never scratched the surface of the 2 decades of community dysfunction from the spill and the litigation, as illustrated in this shame poll. The corporate assault on First Amendment rights began relatively recently. In 1976, the Supreme Court ruled that commercial speech was protected. In this case, the ruling meant corporate persons could spend money to influence elections. In 1978, the Supreme Court reinforced its earlier decision by further protecting political speech. Also, the Supreme Court ruled that corporate persons could spend unlimited money to overturn referendums. In 1986, the Supreme Court ruled that a corporate person's right not to speak was protected, as in the right not to label genetically modified foods, which Europe has largely banned because of health concerns. In 2003, the Supreme Court protected the right of false speech, so ads can lie. For example, Nike's publicized code of conduct did not accurately represent its worker conditions in third world countries. Now, the Supreme Court is considering protection of robust speech. This would pave the way for unlimited corporate campaign contributions, with dire consequences for the Republic. In 2+ centuries of U.S. legal history, a pattern emerges. People acquire rights by amending the Constitution, often through long, drawn-out battles. But corporate persons acquire rights by Supreme Court decisions, simple judicial fiat. For example, corporations receive the status of persons with no public debate. History is now proving that the Supreme Court erred. Legal fictions wielding human rights have taken over our sovereign self-governance and destroyed our republic. Here's the problem. We live in a corpocracy, which is the politest thing that I can call our current form of governance. In a corpocracy, corporate values count. Under U.S. law, corporations exist primarily for the interest of their shareholders, which has been interpreted to mean make money. This drives what author David Korten calls a suicide economy. In a suicide economy, growth is fueled by things like oil spills. For example, in Alaska, Exxon boosted the entire state's gross domestic product in 1989 during the Exxon Valdez oil spill cleanup. Does this mean that we should spill more oil to boost our economy? War and disasters also boost the gross domestic product. Do we want more disasters and wars? Cheap labor is found in prisons in America. So do we want more prisoners? Sick people have to buy medicine and health care. In America, this counts as good for the economy. What's wrong with this picture? Maybe Charlie Wilson was wrong. What's good for General Motors isn't what's good for America. It turns out people value more than money. This is a list of shared values that I compiled from a community unity exercise that I've conducted in cities around the U.S. People value things like affordable homes, living wages, retirement security, affordable health care, safe neighborhoods, quality family time, affordable healthy food, and clean air and water. These values fall into 3 types of wealth or capital. The top 3 examples are economic capital. The middle 3 items are social capital. And the last 2 are environmental capital. Try to put a value on culture or quality family time. The court couldn't do it in the Exxon Valdez case. The court tossed out losses to our way of life, even though the losses were real to us. In a democracy, human values count. These 3 forms of capital weave together to create a quality of life that drives a living economy. Growing wealth is done by full cost accounting. This balances social, economic, and environmental wealth by increasing one form of capital without decreasing the other two. Other industrialized nations do a far better job at this than the United States. For example, according to the United Nations Human Development Report, the U.S. ranks 35th in life expectancy and 29th in infant mortality. The Infant Mortality Index has long been used to measure the quality of a country's medical system. A ranking of 29th means the U.S. pays more and gets far less than it could from our current healthcare system. The U.S. ranks 15th in gender empowerment and first in incarceration. The U.S. also ranks first in greenhouse gas emissions, although China is about to overtake us. In a corpocracy, money counts. Our measure of progress, the gross domestic product, or GDP, consumes social and environmental wealth, and this continues until there is nothing left to consume. The bottom line is, if we want to pass a livable planet to future generations, if we want to grow a new industry free of fossil fuels, if we want healthcare for all, then we need to fix the democracy crisis. We need to reclaim our democracy. Why do we need to do this? Because what happened in Cordova is the democracy crisis in America. What can we do? We can build a movement to pass a federal law or constitutional amendment to affirm that only human persons have human rights. We need to remember our American revolutionary roots. Corporations are not to be trusted. We need protection from corporations, not for them. This is a big goal. Where do we start? Eleanor Roosevelt asked, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? She said, in small places, close to home. They are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in a larger world. Let's look at what the people are doing to abolish corporate persons. There's brush fires of democracy all over the United States. Shapley, Maine passed a local ordinance to abolish corporate persons. So did Barnstead, New Hampshire, and Blaine, Pennsylvania, and many other communities. The issues that ignited these democracy fires were site fights over water rights, industrial farms, uranium mining, Walmarts, among others. Citizens in Spokane, Washington, succeeded in getting a Community Bill of Rights on its November 2009 ballot. Humboldt County, California, is the largest jurisdiction to abolish corporate persons, but corporations overturned the law in state court. Does it matter that corporations are fighting back? No. Citizens in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, have sued their commissioners who blocked a Community Bill of Rights by referendum. People rule, not property. If we succeed, what would change? Under the First Amendment, we could prohibit all corporate political activity, such as donations and lobbying. We could stop misleading ads, such as the ads for cigarettes. We could require labeling of genetically modified foods, because the corporate right not to speak would evaporate. Under the Fourth Amendment, there would be no hiding behind search warrants and no takings. Under the 14th Amendment, we could prevent corporate mergers and owning stock in other corporations. We could levy differential taxes for corporations and restrict their size. We could prohibit activities that harm people and the environment, like cell towers near schools, industrial farms near cities, and Walmarts. We could get off fossil fuels. We could revoke corporate charters by popular referendum. Under the Sixth and Seventh Amendments, we wouldn't lose years of our lives fighting multi-billion-dollar corporations in court. Here's the key. Nothing changes automatically. New laws would have to be written and old ones challenged in court to eliminate corporate protections and personhood. We don't have all the answers. Here's one thing to consider. In the United States, we don't distinguish between types of corporations. So on one hand, corporations are the ruling minority, these big transnational publicly traded companies that are driving the democracy crisis. On the other hand, corporations are churches, neighborhood grocery stores, the Girl Scouts. Corporations are also nonprofit organizations, like our people-sponsored environmental organizations that are pushing for a sustainable future. But they're also corporate-sponsored nonprofit organizations that deny climate change. Look at what we're up against. There's 4 corporate-sponsored oil and coal lobbyists for every member of Congress. We hope you'll help us find answers. How? Start a kitchen table democracy group. It's simple and fun. Host a potluck dinner and serve up food for the stomach and food for the soul. Talk about democracy. Download our organizational packet. This includes ideas to run fun and productive discussions, and it has suggestions for tasks like writing op-ed pieces, circulating petitions, drafting resolutions, ordinances, and referendums. Join our Facebook discussion. This is where we share ideas, what works, what doesn't. This is where we post our needs and topics to discuss and updates. Share information on the bus, at work, with your school kids, at gym, at the store. Encourage others to join the movement. We need to do this because our leaders have warned what will happen if we don't. Franklin Delano Roosevelt warned, the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism. We need to find the courage to care enough to make a difference. Remember the Lorax in Dr. Seuss? Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, it's not going to get any better. It's not. Real democracy is the work of real people. Let's work together to abolish corporate persons. If not for us, for the ones who follow.